Now, in this course section, we learned a lot about the basics of Flutter. And one thing you probably noticed is that if you're using a recent version of Flutter, to be precise, a version greater than Flutter 2, you got deprecation warnings for the buttons we used. And I did talk about that in the lectures where I introduced those buttons already. Now, in this course, we are going to work with those buttons a lot. And with that, I mean the raised button, the flat button, and also the outline button, which is another button which you could use even though we haven't used it up to this point. We're going to work with those button widgets a lot. And since this course was recorded prior to this deprecation, I do use these old buttons, in quotes, in this course. Now, if you follow along with this course, you probably have the best course experience, and it's easiest to follow along if you stick to these deprecated buttons, to these old buttons, so to say, because those buttons, despite being deprecated, are being used in a lot of projects all over the world. You will see them in a lot of other resources and tutorials as well, and using them is not wrong. You can use them, they are here, and they will also stick around for many months to come. If you're getting annoyed by this deprecation warning here in Visual Studio Code, if you're getting annoyed by this strike through effect, you can go to the settings and disable that effect there by searching for deprecated and disabling this show deprecated option. That's an alternative. You don't have to do that, but you can do that if you want to follow along with those existing buttons. But of course, you can also switch. You can switch to the new equivalents for these buttons and follow along with these. That is also fine and of course a bit more future-proof. In the rest of this lecture, I will therefore show you how you can switch from the old to the new buttons, especially when you also have some styling on those buttons. And with that, I'm talking about the raised button, the flat button, and the outline button. Other buttons, like floating action buttons or icon buttons, are not deprecated. It's these three buttons which are deprecated. And hence, if you use raised button, flat button, or outline button in your code, and you are using Flutter 2, you might see this strike-through effect here in Visual Studio Code, which signals that you should not use that button anymore. Though I will come back to this should not use part in a couple of seconds again. Now, the most important message right away is that even though you should not use them anymore, you can absolutely still use them. If I would run this simple demo app here, which really just renders these three buttons, I can still see those three buttons on the screen, and they do work. I can press them, I get no error, everything works. I get my log outputs down there from pressing these buttons. So I can continue using them, and I don't have to change all of them right now. I can do this later in the future. And indeed, you will still see these old buttons, in quotes, get used a lot in other resources, in example apps which you find out there, and in existing code bases of existing projects. That's another reason why you might not want to switch instantly, because you will still find a lot of resources out there which do use these older buttons. Of course, the alternative to sticking to these buttons is to migrate to their new equivalents, because these old buttons were deprecated because there were new button widgets introduced which you should use instead. And we're now going to migrate to these newer buttons step by step over the next minutes. And let's start with the raised button. The raised button will be replaced by an elevated button. Now, for the moment, we'll have to remove color and text color because the elevated button does not support these arguments. But if we would have a button without any custom colors, then migrating to this new button is as simple as swapping out the name, because it's then really just elevated button instead of raised button. And if I save this button is still being rendered, and I'm now using this elevated button. Now, one thing you can already see here is, of course, now that I migrated or switched to this elevated button, we automatically have this blue background and this white text color. Because the elevated button behind the scenes automatically picks up your main theme color set by your application, and that is blue in this case here. And therefore we automatically get this styling which is in line with our theme, which is one of the advantages of the new buttons. We don't have to add styles manually. We do get the base styling fitting our theme out of the box. But of course we can also still style them manually to override the theme color or add other extra stylings. And that's the biggest difference between the old and the new buttons. The old buttons had those extra arguments which you could set for styling them, like the text color, the border size, and so on. The new buttons don't have that. Instead, the new buttons have a single new style argument which you can set to then style this button. And style wants a button style object which you construct by instantiating the button style class. And it's then this button style class where you can set all kinds of styles for this button. And here, for example, you got a background color and you got a foreground color, and you would use these colors to control the text and the, well, background color. Foreground color sets the text, as you see. Background color sets the fill color. So here, if you want to have a raised button with a blue background color and a white foreground color, we could set background color here, but then not to colors.blue. You don't use it like this. Instead, here you then use material state property all and then pass colors.blue to that. Might look a bit strange, but that is how you do then assign a color to this background color argument here for this button style object, which we set as a style for this button. And for the foreground color, it's material state property all colors white. And if we would set this, then we would have this blue button still. But if I, for example, switch my background color to orange and save this, now we have an orange button. So that's how we then style these new buttons with this extra style argument, which takes such a button style object. Now, since assigning styles like this can be a bit annoying, especially drilling into the colors like this can be annoying, there is an alternative way of deriving this style for this button. You can use elevated button, but then not instantiate it, but instead call the style from method there. And on this style from method, you then got a couple of styling arguments like primary. And you can then directly set primary to a color, like color is blue, and this will then affect all the parts of the button that make up this button. So for the elevated button, that button has a background color, and hence it's the background color that's targeted by primary. You got an on primary argument to control the color of the content on the primary color. So in this case, the foreground color on the background. So you could then set this to colors.white. And for example, change this to orange here. And now with that, we would have a simplified way of setting the background and the foreground color here. And you can use either of the two approaches. Create this button style object and set background and foreground color, which is very explicit but a bit longer, or use this style from method to set primary and on primary. Now, attached to this lecture, you also find a link to the official button migration documentation, a document which will also explore how to migrate your buttons and which will dig a bit deeper into styling these buttons, and therefore you can check out that document as well. Now, that's the elevated button, which is our old raised button. Now, for the flat button, we now have the text button. The text button replaces the flat button, and just like the elevated button, it doesn't have these individual style arguments anymore. Instead, it has one style argument, and here again, you set a button style by instantiating it, and then there you can set the foreground color to control the text, and also still a background color if you want to add a background color. By default, a text button does not have a background though, because the idea behind that text button is that it's just text, no background color. But alternatively to setting this button style with foreground and maybe background and maybe other styles, you can also use text button style from here again, and then here set primary to colors.blue or maybe orange so that we see a difference. And if I save this now, the text is orange. And that's important. Primary is not always the background color. Instead, primary really targets the primary thing that makes up this button. And for an elevated button, the primary element is the background, because that's the main thing that makes up an elevated button. It's a button with a background, and therefore primary targets that background. And on primary targets the foreground. For the text button, the primary element is the text, and hence primary targets the text color. Here we also have no on primary argument we could set, because the text button is about not having a background color. If you want the background color, use an elevated button. So that's how we can translate the flat button. Now for the outline button, we have the new outlined button. So the extra D here matters, and that will then replace your old outline button. Here we again don't have those individual style properties. Instead, we can add the new style argument here and set this to a border style again, where we then target the individual styling elements like side for the border side, so the border color and so on. Or we use outlined button style from, and then here again, we can, for example, set the primary color to colors.orange. And if we do that, you will notice that now it's the text again, which is orange. For styling the border, we have this side argument here, and you can always use the auto-completion to see which different arguments you can set here. And that wants a border side object, which you construct by calling the border side constructor, and then there you can set the color of the border side, so of the border overall. And if you now save this, you have an orange border. And that's how we can migrate from the old buttons to the new buttons. Raised button becomes elevated button, flat button becomes text button, and outline button becomes outlined button with an extra D. For simple cases where you don't set any colors or styling, you can just swap the widget names. For more complex buttons where you do add your own colors or your own stylings, there you instead add this style argument instead of the individual style arguments. And then there you either create a button style object with foreground, background color, and so on, or you use these style from methods on the button classes to assign primary colors, background colors, border colors, and so on. Now, as I mentioned, you can stick to the old buttons as well. They will definitely also stay around for many months. But you can, of course, also migrate to these new buttons instead, because overall, as you see, migrating isn't too difficult in the end. It's often just about swapping the names or also about adding these extra style arguments, which then in the end also aren't too difficult to use.